Let me tell you about the person you could have been, the one who looked at a steaming bowl of stew and thought, "No, thanks, I'm saving my appetite for eternity." Not because you were dieting, or because the bread smelled faintly of mold, but because in your world, hunger wasn't a problem. It was the point. You could have been born into any number of centuries where skipping meals wasn't laziness, or poverty, or some doctor's fad diet. It was a badge of honor. Your family might have encouraged it, your neighbors admired it, and your religious leaders practically demanded it. The less you ate, the holier you became, and if you died, even better, that just proved you'd been serious. Hunger has been dressed in 1,000 costumes over the ages, a halo in medieval Italy, a garland of pine needles in the mountains of Japan, a protest banner in an Irish prison cell. It's been called a path to God, a weapon against injustice, and let's be honest, a slow, deliberate way to horrify everyone who cares about you. But here's the strange part. No matter where or when it happens, the rules stay eerily familiar. Step 1. Refuse food. Step 2. Endure the slow unraveling of your body. Step 3. Wait for either enlightenment, victory, or death. And across history, plenty of people have decided that's a gamble worth taking. If you had been one of them, your life would have been measured not in meals, but in the absence of them, in the long, empty stretches where your body shrank and your mind, supposedly, expanded. And that's where our story begins. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. You wake up in Southern Africa, 1878, and the first thing you should know is that you've just been born into a war you didn't start, don't understand, and absolutely cannot win by pretending it isn't happening. The air smells of dust, smoke, and someone else's politics. On one side of the horizon, the British Empire, dressed in red coats, dragging artillery through the Thornveld, like they're hauling civilization itself. On the other, the Zulu kingdom, barefoot, disciplined, and deeply uninterested in being civilized at rifle point. You're about to find out what happens when two completely different ideas of progress meet in a clearing with bad shade. The British, ever the polite house guests, didn't just knock on the Zulu door. They barged in with an ultimatum so unreasonable, it might as well have been written in crayon. Dismantle your military system, disband your regiments, and kindly accept the idea that you now live in our neighborhood. This came from Sir Bartle Frere, a man whose job title was High Commissioner, but whose personal hobby was manufacturing excuses for wars nobody had asked for. The Zulu king Sechueo Kempand read it, or had it read to him. Man responded in the diplomatic equivalent of a raised eyebrow. No. And just like that, the calendar flipped to January 1879 and the war began. You have to understand, this wasn't some random misunderstanding. The British wanted a confederation of southern African territories, a neat little empire-friendly quilt where every patch paid its taxes on time. The Zulu kingdom, meanwhile, had spent decades perfecting a system of regimental service, land organization, and military readiness that made them, frankly, the worst possible people to pick a fight with if you preferred your scalp where it was. Their warriors trained year-round, lived in fortified homesteads, and could walk 40 miles before breakfast, still ready to fight. The Zulu weren't strangers to warfare. They'd been shaped by it literally and politically since Shaka Zulu had taken the throne decades earlier and turned the kingdom into a military machine. British rifles might outrange Zulu spears, but rifles don't load themselves, and redcoats don't march well under a sun that feels like it's auditioning for the role of god of heatstroke. And here's where you come in. Imagine you're standing in the middle, a poor soul in some dusty border settlement. If you side with the British, you're part of an empire famous for asking loyalty in exchange for promises it might forget to keep. If you side with the Zulu, you're aligning yourself with a kingdom whose idea of diplomacy includes disciplined, military encirclement, and the occasional test of your nerve involving very sharp metal. Either way, you're waking up to the sound of someone else's war drums. And because history loves a bit of poetic cruelty, neither side sees you as neutral. To the British, you're a potential recruit, a laborer, or at the very least, someone to keep out of the way while they plant the Union Jack. To the Zulu, you're either an ally or an obstacle in their fields, and obstacles tend to be cleared. The ground you stand on has already been promised, twice over, to two different powers with two very different flags. And the thing about flags is, they're just bits of cloth until someone decides to bleed for them. Which, if you're not paying attention, might be you. And that's the setting before the first spear is thrown, or the first rifle cracked open. It's the last quiet breath before the dust rises. Before the civilizing mission meets the assegai. Before the British Empire learns what it's like to be outnumbered. And before you learn whether you're marching or running when the drums start up again. If you thought the Zulu kingdom was just another rural society the British could pacify between tea breaks, you'd be wrong by several spear lengths, and for that, you can thank one man, Shaka Kase. Imagine if Alexander the Great had been barefoot, armed with a short stabbing spear, and entirely uninterested in marble statues. That's Shaka. Before him, Zulu warfare was, let's call it, low commitment. Warriors would stand a polite distance apart, lob throwing spears, and yell insults until someone got bored or a cow needed milking. It was more about honor than annihilation. Shaka looked at this and thought, cute, but no. His reforms didn't just change the game, they burned the old rulebook and stabbed it for good measure. First came the weapon swap. Out went the long throwing spear. In came the equala, a short broad-bladed stabbing spear designed for up-close work. If the name sounds like the noise it makes when you pull it out of someone's ribcage, that's because it is. Shaka decided that if you were going to fight, you should do it in a way that left no room for the enemy to stand around and think about their life choices. Then came the shield, not the dainty one-handed accessory you might wave around in a parade, but the Isalungu, a 6-foot wall of hardened cowhide you could hide behind like your life depended on it, because it did. And it wasn't just for defense. You used it to hook an opponent's shield aside, open them up like a door in a strong wind, and finish the conversation with your equala. But weapons are only as good as the people holding them, and Shaka understood that. He reorganized the army into Amabutho regiments, grouped by age, trained together, housed together, and drilled into such discipline they could run 20 miles in formation without spilling a drop of the king's beer. These weren't conscripts showing up once a year to look busy. They were full-time warriors who treated marching like breathing and killing like an administrative skill. And then his masterpiece, the buffalo horns formation. It worked exactly like it sounds. The chest hit the enemy head-on, the horns swung around to encircle, and the loins stayed back as reserves, ready to replace the front line or pounce on anyone trying to escape. In a world before radios, the whole maneuver relied on speed, training, and an alarming amount of yelling. Against undisciplined enemies, it was devastating. Against disciplined ones, well, let's just say they didn't stay disciplined for long. Shaka also believed in mobility over metal. The Zulu army didn't bother with armor, slowed you down and made the sun twice as cruel. Instead, they fought nearly naked except for a loincloth, sandals if you were lucky, and the shield in your hand. It wasn't about looking fearsome. It was about getting to the enemy before their breakfast settled. So by the time the British rolled in decades later with their breech-loading rifles and a colonial playbook, they weren't facing a disorganized tribal militia. They were facing the legacy of Shaka, force built for speed, surprise, and the kind of closer-range violence no redcoat wanted in their personal space. And that's the system King Secheo still had at his command in 1879 liner, slightly modernized, but recognizably Shaka's creation. Which begs the question, if you were marching in that army, how exactly would you be arranged, drilled, and thrown into battle? You're not a free agent in the Zulu army. You're an asset filed, categorized, and deployed according to a system so organized it could make an accountant weep with joy. The Amabutho, those age-grade regiments Shaka dreamed up, were still the backbone of Zulu military life under Secheo. And if you'd been born Zulu, the day you crossed into adulthood wasn't marked by a quiet party. No. It was the day you were herded into a military homestead with a few hundred other young men and told, essentially, this is your new family. Learn to kill with them. Each regiment had its own uniform, uniform in the sense of matching cowhide shields, feather headdresses, and body ornaments that said, yes, I belong to this terrifyingly efficient murder club. Some shields were black, some white, some spotted, not because anyone cared about fashion, but because shield colors were a code telling other Zulu units where you belonged in the battlefield hierarchy. To the enemy, it just looked like a wave of deadly moving cowhide. To the Zulu command, it was an instant tactical map. You lived in a kinda, a regimental barracks that doubled as a training ground, ceremonial space, and social control mechanism. Think military base meets cattle enclosure, ringed with huts, each one a reminder that your personal space now belonged to the state. The central open area wasn't for recreation, it was for drills, inspections, and the kind of ritual dances that could terrify an enemy from 100 paces. And speaking of terrifying, the Zulu didn't just march into battle like a rugby scrum gone wrong. They moved as the Impia, full fighting force that could number in the thousands, but moved with the unity of a single organism. An Impi wasn't just guys with spears, it was a carefully assembled machine. Regiments were arranged according to the famous buffalo horns. The center, or chest, engaged head-on. The horns swept around to encircle, and the loins waited behind, fresh and ready to finish whatever was left standing. Your training was endless. Long distance, running barefoot over rocky ground until your lungs screamed. Close combat drills with your shield and ikwa, until your arms felt like they'd been carved from wood. Songs and chants to keep formation and morale during marches, because nothing keeps you moving like the beat of 100 voices promising to spill someone's blood. And all of it designed so that when your regiment hit the field, you didn't think you reacted exactly as you'd been taught. Here's the thing, the MP wasn't just a war machine, it was a political one. Every regiment's loyalty was tied directly to the king, bypassing local chiefs who might get ideas about independence. You weren't just fighting for your life, you were fighting for the centralization of power, whether you knew it or not. And when an impi moved, it wasn't subtle. Scouts went ahead, runners relayed messages back, the dust cloud could be seen for miles. But if you were on the receiving end, you never saw the whole thing until it was too late, just the horns closing in, the shield wall tightening, and the sudden realization that you were in a circle that didn't open outward. Of course, being part of the impi meant knowing exactly how to handle that shield and spear in a way that kept you alive longer than the first charge. Which brings us to the real art form of Zulu warfare, how you fought once you were close enough to smell the other guy's breakfast. You can train all you want, polish your spear until you can see your reflection in it, but if you're marching into battle without a plan, you're just expensive fertilizer waiting to happen. The Zulu didn't just have a plan, they had a pattern. One so elegant and terrifying that British officers would still be muttering about it decades later, over brandy. They called it the Buffalo Horns Formation. And if you'd been in the MP, you wouldn't just know it, you'd live it. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a choreography. The chest was the main force, the big slab of warriors sent to crash into the enemy's front line and pin them in place. You might think of it as the polite handshake before the mugging. Then came the horns. Two curved wings of warriors sweeping out and around both flanks, moving fast, low, and with that unnerving discipline that makes you realize you're about to be the middle of a very bad story. The horns didn't charge blindly, they waited until the chest had fixed the enemy's attention and locked them in place. Only then did the horns snap shut, meeting behind the enemy like a pair of jaws. And finally, the loins, not the most glamorous name, but in Zulu warfare, the loins were the reserves, the muscle you kept hidden just far enough back so they stayed fresh and ready. Once the horns closed and the enemy started to crumble, the loins would surge forward, plugging gaps, reinforcing where needed, and pushing the whole encirclement into a complete collapse. If you were on the outside looking in, the genius was obvious. A fast-moving, flexible trap with no clean escape route. If you were on the inside, well, you probably wouldn't have time to admire the symmetry. You'd be too busy realizing the only way out was through a wall of shields and spears. And here's the unsettling part. This wasn't guesswork. The buffalo horns weren't improvised on the battlefield, they were drilled, rehearsed, refined. Entire regiments spent their youth perfecting this maneuver until they could pull it off in their sleep. It worked on open plains, in rolling hills, even in rough scrubland, because the core idea never changed. Fix the enemy, surround them, finish them. When it worked perfectly, and it usually did against anyone who underestimated it, it didn't just kill the enemy, it annihilated them. The encirclement left no room for retreat. Sometimes the only survivors were the ones fast enough to break through in the first minutes of contact, before the horns locked. And yes, you're probably wondering, what happens if you're in the horns? Well, it's a bit like being the claws on the animal that's about to take down its prey. You move fast, you curve inward, and you don't stop until you've closed the ring. Any gap in the horns is a disaster, because if the enemy slips through, the whole formation can unravel, which means your job, should you find yourself in those horns, is simple. Don't let the ring break, even if it means stepping over your friends. The British would eventually learn to defend against this, but the first time they faced it in force was. Let's just say the Redcoats at Isandlwana weren't exactly sending home glowing reviews. And the thing about those victories is they weren't just down to numbers. They were down to what happened when you were finally close enough to fight hand to hand, which is where the real art began, the shields and the spears. Let's imagine you've just made it through the running, the singing, the encirclement, and now you're standing close enough to your enemy to count the pores on his terrified face. This is where the Zulu way of war stopped being strategied and became something far more personal, something measured in the width of your shield and the reach of your arm. The heart of it was the Isalangu, a tall, narrow wall of hardened cowhide, nearly as long as your body. It wasn't some medieval knight's slab of iron, no. This was light enough to carry at a sprint, tough enough to turn a spear point, and flexible enough to be used offensively, because in Zulu combat, the shield wasn't just for blocking, it was for grabbing. Picture this, you and your opponent are toe-to-toe. You don't just stand there and trade pokes like a pair of amateurs. You hook the rim of your shield around his, wrench it aside, and in that heartbeat of exposed ribs and wide eyes, you drive your Ickleweather, short stabbing spear straight in. It's quick, it's brutal, and it's why you're carrying a spear designed for thrusting instead of throwing. That Icklewa was nasty business, about 2 feet of blade, wide enough to open a wound that couldn't be patched with field stitches, and short enough to work in the crush of melee. He didn't lob it from a distance like the older Asagaishaka, all but banned that style, calling it wasteful. This was a weapon that said, if I'm using it, you're already in trouble. The training for this was relentless. Hours of mock combat, learning to read your opponent's stance, watching for the moment when his shield dipped, when his weight shifted wrong, and you learned not just to attack, but to keep moving, because the Zulu style wasn't about standing your ground. It was about pressing, driving, suffocating the enemy under a storm of shield bumps and spear thrusts until there was no room left for him to breathe, let alone fight. Your shield's color marked your regiment, and in the chaos of battle it told your comrades who was where. Black shields in the center, spotted ones in the Horns-Itch combination, an unspoken map. To the enemy, it was just an overwhelming wall of cowhide and bodies. To the Zulu, it was precise, organized violence. And here's the thing, Zulu warriors weren't armored, no bronze breastplates, no chainmail, just a loincloth, maybe some sandals, and the belief that if you moved fast enough and hit hard enough, you didn't need anything slowing you down. Armor might stop a spear, but it wouldn't stop the hook of a shield or the speed of a flanking run. British soldiers learned this the hard way. At Isandlwana, many of them never got the chance to reload. The distance between first volley and first spear was short, and once the Ikwa was in play, the rifles might as well have been farming tools. The Zulu closed that gap with frightening speed, and once it was closed, it was their kind of fight, not the British's, of course. The shield and spear were only one side of the equation. Because the Zulu weren't marching into war against ghosts, they were facing soldiers with industrial-age weapons. And that meant the battlefield was a deadly contest between speed and technology, tradition and firepower. If you've been imagining this whole thing as some fair contest, spears on one side, rifles on the other, you need to adjust your expectations. The Anglo-Zulu War was the meeting of two very different centuries on the same patch of dirt, and whichever side you were on, the other one had something you really wished you did. On the Zulu side, speed, endurance, and a military culture so drilled that an impi could march 30 miles in a day, barefoot, in formation, and still hit the battlefield fresh enough to break into a sprint. On the British side, breech-loading Martini Henry rifles that spat out 45 caliber lead with enough punch to knock you flat before you heard the crack. Add to that some artillery pieces, a Gatling gun or two, and a belief in the infinite problem-solving abilities of industrial firepower. You, in the middle of this equation, would quickly learn that technology has its quirks. The Martini Henry was a fine rifle, accurate, powerful, and faster to reload than a muzzleloader, but it wasn't magic. In good hands, it could drop a Zulu at 400 yards. In bad hands, or in the chaos of battle, it was a lot of noise and smoke with less effect than the British would have liked to admit. And when 20,000 Zulus decided to close the distance in under a minute, the reload time suddenly felt like an eternity. The Zulus had firearms too. But here's the truth, most were old muskets or worn-out rifles acquired through trade, capture, or colonial leakage. They were often in poor condition, with limited powder and shot. Many Zulu warriors carried guns more as psychological weapons than practical ones, firing a single, inaccurate shot before tossing the thing aside and charging in with the Ikwa. The contrast was brutal. A British firing line could cut down wave after wave at long range, but only if discipline held, ammunition lasted, and most importantly the enemy didn't find a way to get inside that killing zone. The Zulus knew this. They didn't just run straight into the bullets. They flanked, they used terrain, they drew fire at one point and slipped in somewhere else. At Eisenderwana, the perfect storm hit. British troops, overextended and poorly fortified, faced an MP that managed to close the gap. Once the buffalo horns snapped shut, rifles became awkward clubs, and artillery was as useful as a piano in a canoe. In that moment, the battlefield belonged to the spear. Still, in later battles Kumbula, Yolandi the reverse proved true. British troops entrenched behind wagons or earthworks, rifles loaded and steady, mowed down attacking Zulus long before they could get within stabbing distance. Firepower, when used properly, could tear apart even the most disciplined assault. So, survival here wasn't about which weapon you had, it was about making your weapon matter. With a rifle, you needed time and space. With a spear, you needed to erase both before the other guy could use them. And if you had neither, well, that's how you became a casualty statistic, carved into some regimental history book. And yet, the power of the Zulu system wasn't just in the weapons, it was in the moments when that system worked perfectly against all odds. Which is why, when you talk about this war, there's one battle everyone remembers first. If you were going to die in the Anglo-Zulu War, there was a decent chance it would happen on the side of a hill called Isandawana, named that, depending on who's saying it, sounds either like a solemn warning or a story they tell to scare new recruits. It's January 22nd, 1879. You're part of a British column under Lord Chelmsford, and the plan, because there's always a plan, is to advance into Zululand in multiple columns, crush the Zulu army, and be home in time for whatever it is Victorian officers did on weekends. But the plan has a flaw. Chelmsford splits his force, marching out with Huff to chase what he thinks is the main Zulu army, leaving the camp under Lieutenant Colonel Pullian. And if history has taught us anything, it's that leaving a camp underdefended in enemy territory is basically writing an invitation that says, "Please encircle me at your earliest convenience." The Zulu army, around 20,000 strong, had been camped nearby, moving silently, hidden by the folds of the land. They didn't stumble onto the British, they had been stalking them like a lion watching a distracted antelope. And when the moment came, they used the buffalo horns exactly as Shaka intended. Chest in the center, horns sweeping wide, loins in reserve. The British line was stretched thin, ammunition supply chains were shaky, and, crucially, there was no proper fortification, just tents, wagons, and optimism. The firing started well enough. Martini Henry rifles dropped scores of Zulu warriors, the volleys echoing across the plain. But rifles don't load themselves, and ammunition boxes in the Victorian army had a nasty habit of being nailed shut like they contained the crown jewels. Minutes wasted, supply runners scrambling, lines faltering. Meanwhile, the Zulu kept coming fast, low, relentless. Once the horns closed, it was over. The British formation collapsed into desperate knots of men fighting back to back, surrounded by shields and stabbing spears. Rifles became clubs. Bayonets snapped. Officers tried to rally men into defensive pockets, but it was too late. The enemy was already inside the perimeter, and the fight was no longer about holding ground. It was about staying alive for another 30 seconds. By the time the sun slid lower, Isandlwana was littered with bodies, over 1,300 British and colonial troops dead. A catastrophic loss that sent shockwaves all the way to London. For the Zulu, it was the greatest victory of the war. Proof that disciplined close combat tactics could tear apart the pride of the British Empire. But it wasn't without cost. Over 1,000 Zulu warriors were killed, a heavy price even in victory. If you'd been there, your survival would have depended entirely on whether you were lucky enough to break through a gap in the horns early, or unlucky enough to be in the middle when they closed. And make no mistake, most who ran were run down. The Zulu didn't just win the battle, they erased the enemy from the field. But history has a taste for balance. And the same day that Isandlwana turned into a British nightmare, just a few miles away, another fight was brewing, one that would flip the script entirely. If Isandlwana was the British Empire's worst colonial nightmare, Rorke's Drift was the fever dream they used to calm themselves down afterward. Same day, same war, but this time, the story ends with the Union Jack still flying Burley. Picture it, a dusty little mission station on the Buffalo River. Part storehouse, part hospital, part will just keep some supplies here for now. You're one of roughly 150 soldiers, most from the 24th Regiment of Foot, commanded by 2 lieutenants, John Chard of the Royal Engineers, and Gonville Bromhead of the Infantry. Neither man is exactly a household name in military history yet, but that's about to change, mostly because of what's heading their way. Word comes in, 4,000 Zulu warriors, the reserve, from Isandlwana, moving in your direction. These aren't the ones who just fought all morning. These are fresh, eager, and probably feeling pretty good about their odds. And why wouldn't they? You're outnumbered more than 20 to 1, in a makeshift outpost with buildings that wouldn't stop a determined goat, let alone a charging impy. So, you do the only thing you can. You start building. Mealie bags, those big grain sacks, are stacked shoulder-high into barricades. Biscuit boxes form firing platforms. The perimeter is small, tight enough to defend, but just big enough to make you wish it was smaller when the spears start flying. The hospital, already full of wounded from earlier skirmishes, becomes an instant liability. Its walls are thin, its doors few, and its patients in no shape to sprint. By mid-afternoon, the Zulu arrived. First the rhythmic war chants, then the dust, then the sudden sight of hundreds of shields bobbing forward like a tide of leather and muscle. They hit hard. Rifles bark from behind the barricades, dropping attackers in the open, but the Zulu are quick, darting in, firing their own guns, hurling spears, and looking for weak spots. The fight goes on for hours. The hospital catches fire. Defenders inside hack through walls to escape room by room, dragging patients with them while Zulu warriors climb through windows. At the barricades, it's constant, load, fire, pass the rifle back, grab another. No time to think, just the endless rhythm of survival. Night falls, but the Zulu keep coming. Their war cries echo through the darkness, answered by the crack of rifles and the groans of the wounded. Every so often, they surge forward in a wave, sometimes reaching the barricade, sometimes spilling over it, only to be thrown back at bayonet point. It's brutal, it's intimate, and it's exhausting. By dawn, the Zulu are gone. They've lost hundreds of warriors in the attempt, and for whatever reason, respect for the defenders, exhaustion, or orders, they withdraw. The British have held. Against impossible odds, the mission station still stands, and the survivors are so dazed with fatigue they can barely register that they're now national heroes. 11 Victoria Crosses are awarded for Rorke's Drift, the most ever for a single action. The British press seizes on it instantly, because nothing says don't panic, like a miraculous last stand to counterbalance the disaster of the morning. And yet, as the cheers echo in far-off drawing rooms, everyone on the ground knows the truth. This war is nowhere near finished. The Zulu aren't broken. In fact, they're about to put the British in yet another awkward, drawn-out situation, this time in the middle of a siege. If Rorke's Drift was a claustrophobic overnight brawl, the siege of Esho was the long, slow kind of misery, the sort where the enemy doesn't have to kill you outright. They can just wait for time, disease, and your own boredom to do it. You're part of Colonel Charles Pearson's column, one of the British forces advancing into Zululand in January 1879. The plan was simple: move inland, secure Esho, set up a base for further operations. But if this war has taught you anything, it's that plans in Zululand tend to have the lifespan of a mayfly. You arrive at Eshowan, old Norwegian mission station, and start fortifying. Not because you're feeling especially paranoid, but because the Zulu army that just mauled the main British column at Isandlwana is still very much in the field. Pearson's force, about 1,700 troops, including a mix of regular infantry, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries, has to hold the ground until reinforcements arrive. That's the theory. The Zulu oblige by cutting you off almost immediately. No mail, no messengers, no supply wagons. The telegraph line to Natal is severed. You are now a very well-armed, very well-uniformed island in a sea of hostile territory. The siege has begun. Esho itself is not an ideal fortress. The mission buildings are flimsy. The surrounding ground is awkward. So, you get to work, digging trenches, throwing up earthworks, building barricades out of anything you can find. You mount a few artillery pieces on the perimeter, not enough to repel a full-scale assault, but enough to make the Zulu think twice about charging headlong into your lines. And then, you wait. Days turn to weeks. The Zulu don't launch a massive frontal attack. They're too smart for that. Instead, they maintain constant pressure, small probing raids, sniper fire from the bush, cutting off anyone foolish enough to stray beyond the defenses. You quickly learn that the worst sound in Isho isn't gunfire, it's silence. Silence means the Zulu are moving somewhere you can't see. Supplies run low, rations are cut, fresh vegetables vanish, and with them, any hope of avoiding scurvy. The water isn't great. Dysentery does what the Zulu spears can't. You lose men not to heroic last stands, but to the slow erosion of bad food, bad air, and bad luck. Morale dips. The monotony is brutal. You spend your days on watch, scanning the tree line, cleaning your rifle, checking your boots for rot, and wondering if the relief column will make it through. Nights are worst, darkness thick as ink, punctuated by the occasional war cry, just to remind you the enemy is still out there. Finally, in April 1879, the relief force arrives fighting its own battle at Jingandalovut. To get through, the siege is lifted after 71 days, and Isho is evacuated soon after. Officially, it's chalked up as a holding action, but for the men inside, it was more like surviving in a pressure cooker where nothing happened until it did. The lesson: in Zululand, dying quickly in battle wasn't the only way to go. You could also be eaten alive by time. And when the British moved back onto the offensive, they'd find that time and momentum mattered just as much as numbers. Which brings us to the moment when the tide began to turn in earnest, when the Zulu met the British behind proper fortifications and paid dearly for it. If Isandlwana had been the British Empire's slap across the face, Kambula was where they slapped back hard, with the kind of force that left the Zulu army reeling for the rest of the war. It's March 29th, 1879. You're stationed at Kambula, a fortified camp in northern Zululand, under Colonel Evelyn Wood. And here's the first difference from Isandlwana. The place actually looks like it could survive an attack. Wagon loggers, stone redoubts, trenches. You can almost hear the ghost of every soldier at Isandlwana muttering, "See, this is what we meant." Out on the hills, you see them gathering, an impi of around 20,000 Zulu warriors under Prince New. Their goal is simple: destroy the British position, force a retreat, and wipe out this northern column before it can advance any further. The Zulu are confident. They've seen redcoats break before, and they mean to see it again. The attack begins with rifle fire from the Zulu flank, harassing, probing, distracting. Then the main waves come in, the chest moving up the slope, towards the laager. It's uphill for them, and under constant rifle fire. The British here aren't scattered in the open. They're firing in controlled volleys from behind barricades, with artillery and Gatling guns adding their own punctuation marks to the slaughter. The Zulu keep pressing. The horns swing wide, trying to envelop the camp, but woodsmen have arranged the defenses in a square, making it hard for the flanks to bite without being raked by crossfire. The noise is constant Martini Henrys cracking, artillery shells exploding, the deep, rolling chants of the attackers. Several times, the Zulu get close enough for hand-to-hand fighting, but each time they're thrown back. The shields that worked so well at Isandlwana don't mean much against concentrated rifle fire from behind cover, and with every failed rush, the attackers leave more of their dead on the slope. After hours of repeated charges, the Zulu line begins to falter. Wood sees it, and this is where the British flip the script. They toto attack. Cavalry sweeps out from the laager, slashing into the retreating flanks, turning the withdrawal into a rout. By the end of the day, over 2,000 Zulu warriors are dead. British casualties, around 24 for the Zulu. Kambula is more than a battlefield loss, it's a psychological one. It's proof that against prepared defenses, the British firepower advantage is overwhelming. The lesson is immediate. You can't break the redcoats in a fortified position the same way you break them in the open. If you'd been there, you'd have seen the difference in tempo. The British no longer scrambling to hold their lines, but controlling the pace, dictating the terms. For the first time since the war began, it's the Zulu who break away first. And with the northern front secured, the British have room to breathe, regroup. and prepare for the next push, the one aimed at the very heart of the Zulu kingdom, which takes us to the final hammer blow, the capture of Ulundi. By July 1879, the British weren't just looking for another victory, they were looking for an ending. And in Zululand, that ending had a name: Ulundi, the royal capital. If you'd been marching in Chelmsford's column that month, you'd have felt the difference from the early days of the war. This wasn't the overconfident, spread-out force of Isandlwana. This was a deliberate, methodical, advanced columns moving in coordination. Supply lines secured, fortifications built at every stop. It was the empire with its sleeves rolled up, no longer trying to impress, just determined to finish the job. Ulundi itself wasn't just a political center, it was a symbol. The seat of King Sechueo, the heart of Zulu authority, the place where royal regiments could be assembled in days. If the British could take it, the kingdom's cohesion would shatter. Sechueo knew it, Chelmsford knew it, and every warrior in the Impi gathering to defend it knew it. On July 4th, the British reached the plains outside the city. They form into a massive hollow square, infantry on all four sides, artillery and Gatling guns at the corners, cavalry inside, ready to ride out. The message is clear: we learned from Isandlwana, try us now. The Zulu answered the challenge. Around 20,000 warriors advance, their horns spreading wide, the chest pounding forward toward the front face of the square. The scene is almost theatrical: rows of shields, plumes of feathers, the war chants building into a sound that feels more like weather than voices. They charge, rifles open up, the Gatling guns chatter, artillery shells burst among the formations. The effect is devastating. The Zulu push close enough for some to hurl spears into the square, but each rush is met with a wall of concentrated fire. The square holds tight, disciplined, unbroken. The horns can't get around the flanks without running straight into more rifles. The loins never get a chance to swing in. After less than an hour of sustained assault, the Zulu line begins to waver, then break. Chelmsford orders the cavalry outriders burst from the square, cutting down the retreating warriors, driving the rout all the way to the outskirts of Ulundi. By midday, the city is in British hands. Chelmsford orders it: burnt huts, kraals, royal enclosures, all of it, reduced to smoke curling into the winter sky. The fire is more than destruction. It's an announcement. The center of the Zulu kingdom no longer exists. Sechueo flees, only to be captured weeks later. The kingdom is dismantled, broken into administrative districts, its independence gone. On paper, the Anglo-Zulu War is over. In reality, resistance will simmer for years, but the decisive confrontation is finished. If you'd been there, you'd have seen how final it felt, not because of the flames, but because the rhythm of Zulu warfare had been interrupted, maybe forever. The Impi system, the buffalo horns, the close-quarter rushes, all of it had met a formation that didn't break, and that changed everything. But here's the thing about the Zulu army: it had strengths that no British musket could erase. Strengths rooted not in a single city, but in the way the whole kingdom fought, moved, and thought about war. If you think the Zulu kingdom lost the war because it lacked brains, you've been reading the wrong history books. What they lacked in industrial hardware, they made up for in ways that would have terrified any 19th century officer with a decent sense of self-preservation. First, there was mobility. Zulu warriors didn't march like European armies, they ran barefoot, over thorny veldt, across rivers, up slopes, no heavy packs, no wagon trains dragging them down. Each man carried what he needed: his ikwala, his shield, maybe a light throwing spear, and a ration of dried meat. This wasn't just fitness, it was military logistics stripped to its most efficient form. When the Zulu army moved, it could cover 30 miles in a day and still arrive ready to fight. Something no Victorian soldier in a wool uniform and leather boots could do without leaving half the column in the dust. Then there was discipline. Regiments, the Amabutho, weren't just fighting units. They were social institutions. You trained, lived, and fought with the same men for years. You drilled endlessly in formation fighting, learned to read battlefield signals, and could execute complex maneuvers, like the buffalo horns, at a single shouted order. That kind of cohesion made the difference between a dangerous army and a truly lethal one. They also had deep intelligence networks. Scouts weren't an afterthought, they were the eyes and ears of the army. Zulu scouts moved invisibly through the terrain, tracking British columns, counting numbers, noting camp layouts. Many times, the Zulu knew exactly where the British were, long before the British knew where the Zulu were. And then there was morale. The Zulu weren't fighting for a paycheck or a piece of empire. They were defending their homeland, their king, their way of life. Every battle was existential. Victory meant survival. Defeat could mean the dismantling of their entire society. That kind of motivation doesn't show up on a supply ledger, but it weighs heavily in the fight. Even their logistical simplicity was a strength. No need for endless wagons of food or ammunition. They lived off the land when they could, kept moving when they couldn't. A European army caught without supplies risked collapse. A Zulu army just tightened its belt and kept going. And perhaps their most underestimated strength was adaptation. The Zulu weren't dogmatically locked into tradition. They acquired firearms where possible, experimented with their use, and incorporated new tactics from their encounters with colonial forces. While it's true they never matched the British in gun power, they weren't stuck in the past. They were simply working with the tools they had, which, unfortunately for them, weren't enough to match a fortified British square backed by artillery. If you'd been marching with them, you would have felt that strength in your bones, the endurance of endless running, the confidence in the man at your side, the unspoken knowledge that this wasn't just a war. It was a line drawn in the earth that couldn't be crossed without consequence. Of course, strengths mean little without knowing the other side's advantages. And the British had their own, some obvious, more subtle, that shifted the war's momentum once they learned how to use them properly. If the Zulu fought like a sharpened spear, the British fought like a machine, sometimes slow to start, sometimes frustratingly inefficient, but once tuned and aimed, capable of chewing through anything in its path. And their greatest advantages weren't just the shiny bits of metal they carried. They were the habits, formations, and stubborn discipline that made those shiny bits lethal. Let's start with the obvious: firepower. The Martini Henry rifle was no toy. Single-shot, breech-loading, accurate to 400 yards in the right hands, and delivering a .45 caliber bullet that could drop a charging man even if it didn't kill him outright. Against an enemy who relied on closing the distance, that reach was decisive if, and this is a very big if, the firing line held its nerve and its supply chain. Then there was artillery, not just big guns, but the kind of portable field pieces and rocket batteries that could shred formations before they got anywhere near stabbing range. In battles like Kambula and Ulundi, well-sighted artillery was often the difference between a line that bent and a line that held. Fortification discipline was another game-changer. After Isandlwana, the British practically married their defensive works wagon loggers, earthworks, stone redoubts, firing platforms. They learned quickly that the Zulu charge could break almost anything, except a well-prepared position with overlapping fields of fire, and the British fought as units, not individuals. Victorian drill wasn't glamorous hours of marching in perfect step, learning to fire in volleys, moving as a block of men rather than a cluster of them, but it meant that when the Zulu charged, they weren't facing scattered riflemen. They were facing a wall of barrels and bayonets that moved and fired in unison. There's also the matter of logistics. The British could feed and supply a force over long distances, at least when they weren't being overly optimistic about the terrain. Ammunition wagons, ration packs, medical staff, for all the background machinery of war that meant they could keep fighting for weeks without living off the land. The Zulu, for all their endurance, still had to disperse periodically to tend their homesteads. And here's one more subtle advantage: political resilience. The British could lose a battle, as Ndwana proved. Itan still mustered the money, troops, and will to keep going. For the Zulu, every major loss chipped away at their ability to fight the next one. If you'd been in the British ranks, you'd have felt the difference most at night, in a fortified camp, watch fires burning, sentries in place, ammunition dry, officers confident. You'd know that as long as no one did anything stupid, the next morning was survivable. For the Zulu, survivability often depended on surprise and momentum. For the British, it was about stacking the odds before the fight even started. And yet, both sides were still hostage to one constant: the grinding, ugly business of keeping men alive in the field, when neither the land nor the weather is particularly interested in helping. If the battles were sharp and decisive, the days in between were anything but. The Anglo-Zulu War wasn't fought on a convenient chessboard. It was fought across rolling grasslands, thorny bush, rocky escarpments, and river crossings that could go from a gentle ford to a brown churning death trap overnight. And both sides, for all their differences, were equally at the mercy of the land. For the British, Logistics was both their lifeline and their anchor. Every rifle needed ammunition, every soldier needed food, every horse needed feed, and every wagon needed a road or at least something pretending to be one. Columns stretched for miles, moving at the speed of their slowest ox cart. A single broken axle or bogged wagon could snarl the whole advance. And if you lost the supply convoy to bad planning or to a Zulu raiding party, you could find yourself in a very Victorian kind of trouble. Lots of soldiers, no biscuits, and a growing awareness that morale drops faster than a Martini Henry reload speed. The Zulu, by contrast, could move light and fast, but that came at its own cost. Warriors didn't carry much in the way of food, relying on supplies cached along the way or taken from the land. That speed was a weapon, but it was also a clock. Too much time in the field, and men had to disperse back to their homesteads to tend cattle, plant crops, or simply rest. An impi could vanish as quickly as it appeared, not just because of casualties, but because life outside the war didn't stop. Disease was the silent Third Army. For the British, dysentery was a daily companion. Bad water, heat, and cramped camps turned latrines into breeding grounds for misery. Typhoid whispered its way through regiments. For the Zulu, long marches and limited rations could weaken even the toughest fighters. And wounds, no matter how small, could turn fatal without treatment. Infection didn't care if you wore red wool or carried a cowhide shield. And then there was the weather. Zululand's summer heat could crack lips, split skin, and leave men staggering under their kit before a single shot was fired. Sudden rains could turn the ground into a sucking swamp, drowning carts and ruining powder. A bright, dry day could flip into a storm, so fast that tents were blown flat before anyone could curse about it. The human cost wasn't just in the dead. It was in the wounded, left behind, the amputations done under canvas, without enough chloroform, the warriors who limped home to a kraal that no longer had enough cattle to feed them. It was in the nightmares, the fevers, the quiet attrition of men wearing down long before they fell. If you'd been there, you'd have learned fast that survival wasn't just about winning the next fight. It was about making it to the next fight in the first place. And for all the grit and endurance on both sides, the war's outcome would still boil down to one question. If you were caught in the middle, could you survive at all? Which brings us, finally, to the reckoning. Let's set aside the history books for a second and imagine it's you. Yes, you on the Zululand veldt in 1879, not as a comfortable spectator, but as a warm body in the middle of someone else's war. Forget who's right or wrong for the moment. Survival doesn't care about politics. It cares about whether you've got the legs, the luck, and the nerve to see tomorrow's sunrise. If you were marching with the Zulu, survival meant speed and discipline. You'd have to run for hours, barefoot, shield on your arm, spear in your hand, and still arrive with enough strength to charge. You'd have to trust the man next to you to close the shield wall, to hook the enemy's guard away, to keep the horns from breaking open. And you'd have to accept that sometimes, no matter how fast you were, you'd be running into rifle fire you couldn't outrun. The key to living another day: choosing your ground, keeping your momentum, and getting in close before the enemy could reload. If you were with the British, survival was a slower kind of game. You'd dig trenches until your hands blistered, stack mealie bags into walls, and pray the supply wagons didn't get stuck to rivers back. Your life would depend on the discipline of the firing line and holding steady when the shield wall came pounding up the slope, on reloading without fumbling, on not breaking formation when the war cries hit your nerves like cold steel. And if the enemy got inside your perimeter, well, your bayonet work had better be as good as your volley fire. On either side, the terrain was your constant companion and occasional executioner. Hills to climb, rivers to cross, grasslands offering no cover, and thornbush that seemed designed specifically to shred skin. The weather could kill you before the enemy did. A sun that sucked you dry, a storm that drowned your powder, nights so cold you'd swear the air was chewing on your bones. The truth is, could you survive? Isn't really a question about physical strength, it's about adaptability. Could you adjust your instincts to a war where speed is life one moment and stillness is life the next? Could you eat whatever you were given, march wherever you were told, and fight in a way that was utterly alien to the world you knew? And, perhaps the hardest part, could you do it again the next day, and the next? Most who fought here didn't get to choose. For the Zulu, it was the defense of their kingdom, their king, their way of life. For the British, it was empire's business, dressed in red wool and brass buttons. For the men caught between colonial auxiliaries, local settlers, it was survival in the most literal sense. So, could you survive the Zulu War? Maybe. But only if you learned fast, moved faster, and understood that out here, you weren't fighting for glory, you were fighting not to be another nameless figure in someone else's casualty report. And if you're hesitating on that answer even for a heartbeat, then I've got bad news. The horns are already closing, and you're standing in the chest. It begins, as many improbable human experiments do, with the conviction that the body is an inconvenience. Somewhere between the Indus and the Ganges, a gaunt figure sat cross-legged beneath a sal tree, insisting that bread was a distraction and that true nourishment came from the air itself. Ancient Indian ascetics called it pyahara brithitian, a practice so literal in its name and so implausible in its mechanics that one wonders if it was born from a joke that nobody dared to laugh at. They claimed that the same life force that kept the wind moving through the reeds could keep bones from collapsing and hearts from slowing. The idea wasn't confined to India. Taoist hermits spoke of bigu, avoiding grains, not as dietary preference but as a form of molecular rebellion, denying the agricultural tether that bound humans to the soil. Grain was for villagers and tax collectors. Immortals, or those pretending to be, subsisted on dew and moonlight. And in the arid expanse of Christian desert monasticism, the pattern repeated: gaunt figures wrapped in coarse wool, sipping nothing more than morning fog, their ribs spelling out psalms no one could read. These weren't merely survival strategies, they were cosmologies written in skin and breath. If one could live on air, one was no longer bound by the rules of beasts and farmers. The stomach became obsolete, a redundant organ for those who had upgraded to celestial metabolism. And while neighbors measured wealth in sacks of barley, the inebriate measured theirs in hours spent without chewing time transmuted into virtue. Yet the suspicion remained, even then, that these claims brushed against the impossible. Ancient observers alternated between reverence and quiet doubt, slipping offerings of fruit or milk to the supposed breatharians when no one was looking, just in case. Because starvation, dressed up as sanctity, has always had a dangerously thin margin. And that's precisely where the practice evolved into something else, where the absence of food stopped being an end in itself and started becoming the hallway to the divine. If breath-eating was the headline, fasting was the fine print, a far more common, though no less punishing, path. Across deserts, forests, and icy mountain passes, abstaining from food became the skeleton key to open doors no ordinary appetite could find. The pattern was almost suspicious in its universality. Saints in limestone caves, shamans in wind-battered tents, prophets pacing beneath constellations they claimed were speaking to them, all trimming the body down until the mind had room to roam. Among Sufi mystics, the chiller 40 days of seclusion and bare subsistence wasn't just a spiritual test, it was a kind of distillation. By the end, the practitioner was said to have shed every distraction, including hunger itself. In the Buddhist Utanga austerities, monks wandered barefoot, eating only what fit into their begging bowls, and sometimes not even that. Hunger sharpened the senses, or so the tradition insisted. Each pang became a bell, calling the mind back to the present moment. Anthropologists have long noted that prolonged fasting shows up where people seek visions. Native American vision quests, for example, stripped away not only food but all familiar stimuli. Without chewing, without swallowing, without even the grounding rhythm of mealtimes, the mind stopped pacing in its cage and began clawing at the bars. And in those sleepless, calorie-starved hours, the bars seemed to melt. It was rarely a private affair. Fasting was theater, whether performed before a tribe, a monastery, or an imagined audience of gods. The watcher, whether human or divine, was as essential as the hunger itself. No one ascended to higher planes quietly. Even the hermit in the mountains relied on rumors drifting down to the valleys to keep his sanctity intact. The body shrank, but the myth swelled. And eventually, the myth took on a new form. The body was no longer merely the vessel for endurance, it became the experiment itself, a living specimen in the hands of the one willing to risk it all for a glimpse of eternity. For the mystic, the body wasn't a cage to be endured, it was a laboratory bench. Every ache, every dizzy spell, every pulse of weakness was a data point in the grand experiment of proving the flesh unnecessary. This wasn't asceticism for modest effect. It was methodical dismantling, a deliberate trial to see just how much biology could be bent before it broke. In medieval monasteries, chroniclers recorded brothers who took their meals down to crumbs so small they could pass unnoticed through a beard. In Himalayan caves, yogis slowed their breathing to a thread, skin blanching in the cold as if the blood had withdrawn to the spine for safekeeping. Even missionaries, arriving with their own doctrines of restraint, wrote back to Europe astonished at what they witnessed: men and women who, by any medical reasoning, should have been horizontal and silent, yet remained upright, chanting, and apparently untroubled. There were, of course, charlatans in the mix. There always are. Ascetic frauds have been caught with bread hidden in their bedrolls, or accepting the occasional clandestine fig from an overly pious admirer. But the genuine practitioners, the ones who truly tried to replace grain with breath, tended to wear their effort plainly, eyes receding into sockets, skin dry as parchment, nails growing brittle and opaque. Their bodies became textbooks, annotated in bone and sinew, documenting what happens when matter is traded for conviction. It wasn't a cruelty inflicted by others, it was self-inflicted, which somehow made it more tolerable to witness, and more unsettling to contemplate. If a human could deliberately walk to the threshold of collapse and hold there for weeks, what did that say about the rest of us, flinching at the faintest pang of hunger? The answer, for the mystic, was that collapse was not a danger to be avoided, but a door to be found. And like all doors, it required a key, and for many, that key was the simplest, clearest substance still allowed: water. For those who swore off food entirely, water became the sole remaining conversation between body and earth. It wasn't merely hydration, it was ritual, medicine, and sometimes sacrament. In many traditions, the act of drinking was pared down to its most deliberate form: a slow sip at dawn, perhaps another at dusk, as if each drop had to be coaxed into service. Sacred springs often became the favored source. In the Himalayas, monks trekked miles to glacial meltwater, claiming it carried the memory of clouds and thus retained some trace of heaven. In the Christian desert, hermits sought wells dug, according to legend, by saints or angels, their brackish depths transformed into relics by faith alone. In Japan, Yamabushi ascetics would stand beneath freezing waterfalls, swallowing water as it battered their skulls, believing that its purity could scour the body from the inside out. Anthropologists have noted that water often carried a double meaning in these practices. It was at once a physical sustainer and a symbolic solvent. To drink was to live. To drink mindfully was to dissolve the self. And when you were consuming nothing else, each swallow seemed to ripple through the body like a miniature tide, as if the bones themselves could feel it. It also served as the line in the sand between possible and impossible. Without food, the body can survive for weeks. Without water, days. To keep water was to keep one thread to the human world, fragile, yes, but unbroken. And yet, for some, even this thread seemed optional. They spoke of living on nothing at all, of feeding on light and air alone. And if that sounds like myth, it is but like most enduring myths. It had a technique, a discipline, and an unnerving level of anatomical intent. If water was the last tether, breath was the invisible rope they claimed could haul a person beyond hunger entirely. In the yogic traditions of pranayama, breathing wasn't a reflex, it was a craft. Each inhale was measured, sifted, and stored. Each exhale shaped and slowed, until the lungs seemed less like organs and more like alchemical bellows. Taoist adepts practicing qigong spoke of drawing qi down into the belly, letting it pool in the dantian like a reservoir you could sip from in place of broth. Christian hesychasts, hunched in stone cells, whispered the Jesus prayer in rhythm with their breath until the words became oxygen itself. The lungs filled not with air, but with syllables. An inhalation was Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, an exhalation, have mercy on me. The cadence was hypnotic, the body lulled into a slower metabolism, as though the blood were learning to live on fewer heartbeats. Physiologists, centuries later, would observe that deep, slow breathing can lower oxygen consumption, reduce metabolic rate, even alter thermoregulation. To the mystics, this wasn't a scientific discovery, it was proof that they'd been right all along. Breath could be food, and food could be forgotten. The ribcage became a kind of wind harvest, drawing sustenance from the same air that bent reeds in the marsh or pushed clouds across the sky. But breathwork was more than survival, it was transformation. The long, deliberate inhales seemed to carry with them an intimacy with the world that eating could never provide. A spoon separated you from what you consumed. Breath did not. And when the stomach was empty long enough, the breath began to taste like something like iron, or flowers, or the faint sweetness before rain. That taste was often the first sign that visions were near, and hunger was about to change shape into something far stranger. After days without food, the body begins to whisper. After weeks it starts to sing. Not pleasantly, more like a wavering tone that wavers between warning and invitation. In many cultures, that song was taken as proof the practice was working. When the stomach fell silent and the mind began to hum, the mystic knew they were crossing the invisible border between endurance and revelation. Physiology offers a blunt explanation. Starvation alters brain chemistry. Glycogen reserves empty, ketones rise, and the mind deprived of its usual fuel starts scavenging in unusual corners. For the mystic, this biochemical improvisation was not failure, but the signal that doors were opening. Native American vision quests sought exactly this moment, for days into fasting beneath the sky, when light became sharper, wind more articulate, and the boundary between waking and dreaming grew porous. In medieval Europe, saints described the same shimmering unreality. Catherine of Siena wrote of tasting heaven itself during her fasting trances, her body nearly transparent beneath her robes. Buddhist ascetics, perched on remote cliffs, reported visions of Buddhas radiating from the rocks, their forms pulsing in rhythm with the practitioner's own heartbeat. The cause didn't matter, the content did, and the visions had rules. They were never purely ornamental. They arrived with messages, assignments, warnings. The mystic returned, not with vague inspiration but with instructions. Plant here, walk there, speak this, silence that. It was a transaction, not a gift. And the hunger stayed as both proof and anchor, a reminder that to eat again too soon was to risk losing the clarity entirely. In time, these altered states became part of the public theater of sanctity. Communities didn't just tolerate their mystics, hollow cheeks and distant gazes, they expected them. The fasting body became a stage where the divine could appear, a thin curtain between worlds, and audiences, mortal and otherwise, were eager to watch. In villages, monasteries, and market gossip, the living on-air mystic occupied a peculiar niche, half miracle, half suspicion. To the devout, they were proof that holiness could override anatomy, a walking refutation of every farmer's fear that a bad harvest meant certain death. To skeptics, they were simply excellent actors with an unusual commitment to their role. The reception often depended on proximity. Those who lived alongside the mystic saw the tremor in their hands, the moments when their gaze faltered, the faint smell of a body burning through itself. From afar, though they seemed untouchable slim silhouettes framed by temple doorways, eyes so sunken they might as well have been looking at another world entirely. Public displays became part of the role. Some mystics allowed themselves to be observed day and night, visitors keeping watch to confirm they ate nothing. Others turned their practice into pilgrimage, traveling from shrine to shrine, not to speak or teach, but simply to be seen. Their frailty became a kind of currency. The more improbable their survival, the richer the spiritual return for those who witnessed it. And yet admiration often carried an undertone of unease. These were people who had, in a sense, stepped out of the shared human contract. Eating was one of the few acts that made everyone equally animal. To refuse it consistently, defiantly, was to announce that you no longer belonged entirely to the species. This, too, could inspire resentment. More than one mystic's story ends, not in quiet transcendence, but in exile, accusation, or the slow erosion of their legend once a hidden cache of bread or milk was discovered. Still, those who endured without scandal became something rarer than saints. They became landmarks. Villagers measured time by their continued presence. She's still alive, functioning as both miracle and calendar. and within this rarefied circle, patterns emerged, including one that revealed just how much gender shaped the rules of who could go hungry for God without being burned for it. The hunger of a man and the hunger of a woman were rarely weighed on the same scale. Male ascetics could let their ribs show and be praised for spiritual discipline. Female mystics who did the same risked being called witches, hysterics, or dangerously vain. Yet history is salted with women who starved themselves into sainthood or, at least into the folklore of their communities. St. Catherine of Siena is the most cited. Her holy anorexia framed by hagiographers as both devotion and defiance. She claimed to live on nothing but the Eucharist, turning bread and wine into the sole tenets of her body. For her followers, this was miraculous. For her confessors, unnerving. Physicians sent to examine her often left with nothing more diagnostic than an uneasy admiration and the faint smell of incense clinging to their robes. In India, female sadvists sometimes mirrored the austerities of their male counterparts, though their fasting was often reframed by the community as an act of purity or marital fidelity, rather than metaphysical exploration. In medieval Europe, women mystics' refusal to eat could be romanticized as bridal devotion to Christ. The stomach, offered as dowry. The body became a symbolic vessel, emptied of worldly fuel to make more room for the divine. Gender also dictated the level of surveillance. A man might vanish into the wilderness for a season and return gaunt but unchallenged. A woman's inedia was more likely to be witnessed, documented, and either celebrated or pathologized in detail. This scrutiny meant that female fasting saints often left behind richer descriptions of their visions, ecstasy, and bodily states than their male peers' accounts that blend theology, autobiography, and what can only be read as medical case notes. But the asymmetry in perception also left women more vulnerable to accusations when the human limits of their endurance became visible. A fainting saint could be a miracle or a fraud, depending on who was watching and who stood to gain from the verdict. These tensions between faith, body, and proof became fertile ground for early modern medicine and anthropology to step in, notebooks in hand, claiming to measure what holiness actually cost in calories. By the time the Enlightenment rolled in with its microscopes and measuring tapes, the mystic, who lived on water and air, was no longer just a curiosity. They were a problem to be solved. Physicians began showing up at monasteries and hermitages with scales, stopwatches, and an unshakable suspicion that somewhere, somehow, a slice of bread was being smuggled in under the cloak of piety. Case studies emerged, some sincere, others dripping with condescension. In the 17th century, English doctors monitored the so-called fasting girl of Wales, a teenager said to have gone years without food. The investigation, meant to confirm a miracle, instead exposed a family quietly feeding her at night. Yet not all examinations ended in debunking. Some records describe subjects who genuinely appeared to survive on astonishingly little, leaving the observers with nothing but question marks and professional discomfort. Anthropologists faced a different tangle. Documenting anedia meant navigating between respect for the community's beliefs and the outsider's impulse to test them. Was it more ethical to take the mystic at their word, or to treat their claim as an experiment waiting to be run? Field notes often betray this tension. Meticulous descriptions of ritual and setting sit alongside measurements of pulse, urine output, and weight loss. The dilemma was and remains that both views can be true at once. From within the culture, the mystic's survival is a sign of divine favor. From outside, it's a physiological puzzle, possibly soluble with enough data and persistence. Yet neither lens seems to catch the whole of it. Whether or not the practice was literally sustainable mattered less to the community than the fact that it was being done. The act itself, public, disciplined, unwavering, was the proof. Still, the era of scientific scrutiny didn't end the phenomenon. It only reframed it, giving rise to a new category of practitioners who borrowed the old mystic's language but placed it in modern, even commercial settings. The breatharian of the New Age would claim lineage from saints and sadhis, but their light came from a different sun. The mystic who once fasted in a mountain cave now occasionally wears yoga pants and hosts retreats in Bali. What was once framed as divine discipline has, in some circles, been rebranded as living on light or breatharianism. Its marketing is sleek, as its origins were ragged. The claim remains the same: sustenance without food, but the setting has shifted from monastic cell to wellness brochure. The lineage is real enough, Modern breatharians point to saints, sadhis, and Taoist immortals as proof that the human body can survive on prra, ki, or universal energy. They offer workshops in transitioning away from food, blending ancient breathing techniques with affirmations, sun gazing, and often a subscription package. The aura of mystery remains, but now it comes with a liability waiver. Anthropologists note that this revival mirrors the older patterns exactly: a small group of true believers, a larger audience of fascinated skeptics, and a steady stream of scandals when practitioners collapse or are caught eating in secret. The tension between faith and biology hasn't softened, if anything. The medical language of the modern era has made the contradictions starker. Yet the stories endure, because they speak to a deeper human itch, the dream of not being bound by the hungers that rule us. In the end, the phenomenon sits in the same uneasy place it always has, somewhere between metaphor and miracle. Whether in a Himalayan hermitage, a medieval convent, or a YouTube livestream, the spectacle of someone apparently surviving on nothing continues to draw eyes. Not because the audience truly expects to see the impossible proven, but because the sight of it frail, still, and strangely luminous feels like an answer to a question no one can quite phrase. And perhaps that's why, from the first breath-eater under the sal tree to the last influencer selling sunlight in capsules, the story refuses to starve to death. Some tastes never make it onto the dinner table unless the table is made of clay. Eating earth, ash, or charcoal has always hovered in that strange space between scandal and survival. The kind of practice outsiders wrinkle their noses at while insiders barely notice. In the annals of anthropology, it has a name, geophagy, though most societies that practice it never bothered with such a clinical label. They just reached for a lump of soil the way others might reach for salt. Ancient Greece knew it well enough. Physicians from the Hippocratic tradition prescribed certain clays for stomach ailments, while their patients probably didn't bother pretending it was medicinal every single time. In Rome, the natural historian Pliny the Elder wrote about earth from Lemnos, shaped into little tablets and stamped with the goddess Artemis, part pharmacy, part talisman, and, no doubt, part snack. Even in the 19th century, European visitors to West Africa, South America, and the American South scribbled in their travel journals about people eating dirt, with the kind of fascination usually reserved for comets or crimes. But the habit wasn't born from boredom. It was folded into everyday life so seamlessly that no one thought to explain it. Sometimes it was medicinal, sometimes ritual, sometimes just something you did because your grandmother did. One person's taboo was another's pantry staple, and the line between necessity and tradition blurred like ash dissolving in water. That's the problem with taboos. They only exist if you agree on them. And in the places where the soil was sweet, the ash was pure, and the charcoal was clean, the agreement leaned the other way entirely, which is why the practice never really needed defending. It worked. And once something works, whether to soothe the gut, quiet a fever, or keep a spirit from looking your way, you don't throw it out just because someone else finds it unsightly. You keep it, the way some keep a lucky stone in their pocket, or a charm under their pillow. And perhaps that's why clay, of all things, became medicine before medicine had a name. Clay doesn't look like medicine. It looks like the thing you scrape off your boots before going indoors. Yet for centuries, millennia, even it's been swallowed with the confidence usually reserved for trusted herbs or expensive pills. The secret is in the chemistry. Certain clays, like pale kaolin or deep red laterite, have a knack for binding to toxins, coaxing them out of the body before they can do harm. They cling to alkaloids from bitter roots, to plant tannins that upset the stomach, even to microscopic parasites drifting through the gut like uninvited guests. In parts of West Africa, women still keep neat stacks of sun-dried clay pellets, ready to chew like lozenges. In the Amazon, riverbank clay is scooped and mixed with water into a chalky drink, unglamorous, yes, but gentle on the stomach, after eating wild tubers that might otherwise protest. And among certain indigenous peoples of North America, earth was baked into thin sheets alongside meat, an invisible shield against foodborne illness that no one had to over-explain. The logic is entirely practical. Clay absorbs not in the poetic metaphorical sense, but in the chemical one. A spoonful could mean the difference between riding out a bad meal and being flattened by it. Modern lab tests confirm what countless generations already knew. Kaolin reduces diarrhea, neutralizes pathogens, and even eases nausea. In other words, it's one of the oldest, cheapest, and most effective remedies humans ever stumbled across, which might be why it survived into the age of antibiotics, without apology. Yet clay rarely stayed in the realm of bare necessity. It often carried an aftertaste of ritual, a pinch before a journey, a pellet after childbirth, a handful during a seasonal festival. Medicine, in these contexts, was never just about the body. It was about belonging to the land, to the lineage, to the cycle of health and hazard that shaped daily life. And if clay could seal a stomach, it could also seal a pact. Ash has a way of making itself memorable. It clings to the skin after fire, drifts into the air with the faint smell of wood gone to bone, settles on everything like the slow handwriting of time. In many communities, it wasn't simply waste, it was a residue of transformation, carrying something of the tree, the flame, and the smoke in its pale body. Consuming it was never just about minerals, though minerals there were: calcium, potassium, magnesium, tiny traces of what the fire didn't burn away. Among certain West and Central African traditions, ash played its part in ceremonies that blurred medicine with magic. A pinch in water to cool the body after a fever, or to calm the spiritual heat that followed childbirth. In other places, wood ash from sacred fires was rubbed on the skin, then licked from the fingers as if to draw the protection inward. There were even initiations where swallowing ash was a test, to take in the remains of a fire without flinching, to show you could carry both its warmth and its stillness. Sometimes the act was mundane, part of everyday cooking. In Mesoamerican kitchens, ash was soaked into maize to loosen the hulls, a process called nixtamalization. But the water, still clouded and mineral-rich, was not always thrown away. Drinking it could be as ordinary as sipping broth, and in more scattered traditions, ash was stirred into gruel or porridge, a thin grey swirl that was both nourishment and reminder. The fire has already burned, and you are still here. There was a certain symmetry in it, taking into the body what had once been fuel, turning it into a different kind of fuel altogether. If clay tethered you to the soil, ash tethered you to the flame. But there was another blackened relic of fire that held its own place in the human diet, one even stranger to outsiders, one that did not dissolve softly like ash, but bit back. Charcoal is fire made patient, where ash is the ghost of what burned. Charcoal is its preserved skeleton, black, porous, and strangely light in the hand. It looks like something you'd pull from the bottom of a ruined kettle, yet across continents it found its way into mouths as readily as into hearths. Its usefulness was almost alchemical. Those delicate carbon lattice trapped more than heat. They trapped toxins, odors, even the sharp sting of spoiled water. In parts of the Amazon, chunks of charcoal were crumbled into drinking gourds to sweeten river water, the grit settling like a dark snowfall to the bottom. In Japanese tradition, Binchoten charcoal was long prized for the same reason, a quiet filtration that didn't just purify but soften the taste. Charcoal was also swallowed directly, a pinch here, a fragment there, especially after eating questionable food. In West African villages, women chewed it for stomach cramps or morning sickness, the bitterness cutting through nausea like a warning that doubled as a cure. Even European physicians, suspicious of anything without a Latin label, eventually caught on. By the 19th century, powdered charcoal was prescribed in pharmacies for flatulence and poisoning alike. But in some places, charcoal did more than settle a gut. It warded off the unseen. Blackened mouths were said to confuse evil spirits, making the living look like something already claimed by death. Charcoal lines on the skin, licked off during ritual, could form a protective ring around the soul. Here, purification wasn't only physical, it was a way of armoring yourself against the invisible. And for all its grit, charcoal carried a strange intimacy. He kept it close, in the kitchen, in a pouch, in the ash heap by the fire. A medicine, a charm, a filter, a shield. It was whatever the day demanded. and when the body that consumed it was carrying another life, the demand could be even more urgent. Pregnancy has a way of rewriting the rules of appetite. Across countless societies, women in the early months have reached not for fruit or broth, but for the nearest piece of soil, a fragment of charcoal, or a soft pinch of ash. Outsiders called it strange. Insiders often called it necessary. The cravings had patterns, a taste for cool, powdery clays, or the smooth crunch of sun-baked earth after rain, and they were rarely dismissed as whimsy. In parts of West Africa, small cakes of kaolin were sold in markets alongside food staples, their price shifting with the seasons like any other produce. Among rural communities in the American South, pregnant women would sometimes scrape clay from riverbanks in secret, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt private, almost intimate. In Papua New Guinea, earth-eating during pregnancy was explained with quiet pragmatism. The baby takes minerals, the mother puts them back. There was also the unspoken belief that what was swallowed could influence the child, not just its health, but its temperament, its connection to the land. Eating a little of the earth could make a child strong in the same way that eating the meat of a swift animal might make it quick. And while modern medicine would later argue for iron supplements, calcium tablets, or prenatal vitamins, these were all, in their own way, less poetic replacements for something older. Cravings weren't always gentle. Some women described them as urgent, almost compulsive, as if their bodies were recalling a ritual before their minds could explain it. And in communities where soil was thought to hold ancestral essence, those cravings were not just tolerated, they were honored. The land had fed the lineage before. It would feed the next one too. And yet, earth and ash and charcoal did more than nourish the pregnant. They could also strip away what was unwanted, prepare the body, and sometimes the soul, for something harsher. Which is why, in certain rites of passage, swallowing them became a threshold act. In many traditions, the passage from one stage of life to another required more than endurance or ceremony. It demanded swallowing the world in its rawest form. Earth, ash, or charcoal could be the first thing an initiate consumed, a mouthful of the element they were expected to master. It was never served delicately. Sometimes it came in a lump still warm from the fire pit. Sometimes in a fistful of soil pressed into the palm, with the same weight as an oath. In parts of East Africa, new warriors were made to eat earth from the training ground, binding them to the land they would defend. In the Pacific, ash from a ceremonial fire might be mixed with coconut water and passed between initiates, the bitter drink sealing their new status as if with invisible ink. And in the highlands of South America, charcoal could be taken after long fasting, its gritty texture a reminder that purification was rarely pleasant. These ingestions worked on more than one register. Physically, they cleansed, absorbing the last traces of food, flushing the body before new taboos and obligations set in. Spiritually, they marked the liminal state, no longer who you were, not yet who you would be. The substance itself, cold ash, bitter charcoal, damp earth, was as much a teacher as any elder, stripping away the comfort of sweet things so the lessons would sink in sharper. Even in funerary rites, echoes of initiation lingered. Mourners in some communities took small amounts of ash from the deceased's final fire, a way of carrying part of the passage themselves. Here, purification was not about entering adulthood or warriorhood, but about walking alongside the dead without drawing them back. If clay tethered you to the land and ash tied you to the fire, these rites fused them into something more potent, a direct exchange with the forces that shape life and undo it. And beneath all these practices ran a current of meaning older than the ceremonies themselves, a cosmology where consuming the elements wasn't just symbolic, it was a kind of conversation, and that conversation became most vivid when earth, ash, and charcoal were seen not as tools, but as pieces of the cosmos itself. In worlds where the earth itself was alive, eating a handful of it wasn't just consumption, it was communion. Soil was not inert matter. It was the skin of the ancestors, the surface of creation, the layer in which both seeds and bones slept. To take it into the body was to take in continuity. Among certain West African cosmologies, the land was the great witness to every oath and betrayal, and swallowing a pinch of its clay during rituals bound the speaker to truth in ways no paper contract could. Ash carried its own sacred weight. It was the ghost of fire, the memory of transformation. In some Central African traditions, ash was cool, not in temperature, but in spiritual temperature, able to dampen the heat of anger, lust, or vengeance. It was also liminal. It had been wood, it had been flame, and now it was neither. To ingest it was to bring that liminality inward, to exist briefly in a space where change was possible. Charcoal, the black heart of the fire, was both feared and revered. In certain animist belief systems, its darkness was a camouflage, making the eater invisible to spirits that hunted in the night. In others, its blackness was a sign of having swallowed the power of fire without being consumed by it. In all these beliefs, ingestion wasn't symbolic in the abstract sense. It was tactile, immediate, physical. The grit between the teeth, the faint metallic temps, the dryness on the tongue, these were the sensations that anchored the spiritual act. And while the modern mind might separate the physical from the sacred, these traditions made no such distinction. A stomach full of soil could be as much a prayer as a song. Yet for all their spiritual depth, there were times when these acts had no ritual pretext at all. Times when the choice to eat dirt, ash, or charcoal was simply a choice between that and nothing. Hunger has a way of stripping dignity from the menu. In drought years, in seasons when the rains didn't come or the herds thinned to shadows, people turned to what the earth would give, even if it wasn't quite food. In the Pacific Islands, fine volcanic ash was stirred into thin broth when fish were scarce, giving at least the illusion of substance. Along the East African rift, certain pale clays were dug from deep pits and shaped into loaves, dried in the sun, and chewed slowly to quiet the stomach. They didn't nourish in the usual sense, but they filled the mouth, anchored the hours, and kept the body upright until something better came along. Famine archives from colonial records, dry and officious as they are, contain notes of entire communities surviving for weeks on earth cakes or charcoal biscuits, each word dripping with condescension from the observer's pen. Yet these makeshift rations were often the difference between enduring a lean season and leaving graves behind. The practice was less about feeding the body than buying it time, and there was an art to it. Not every soil was safe, not every ash free of toxins. Knowledge of where to dig and what to burn was passed down like the knowledge of fishing grounds or planting cycles. A wrong choice could be as fatal as the hunger it aimed to soothe. The taste of these survival meals was rarely spoken of, perhaps because it needed no commentary. Hunger changes the tongue. What would once have been bitter becomes neutral. What would have been neutral becomes a small, hard mercy. And when the rains did return, the habit of earth-eating often lingered, not as a grim reminder, but as a quiet testament that the people had lived through what was meant to break them. Still, survival stories rarely sound noble to those who've never had to tell them, and when colonial eyes turned on these practices, they rarely saw resilience, they saw pathology. When European missionaries, traders, and colonial doctors first recorded the sight of people eating clay, ash, or charcoal, their notes rarely hinted at respect. The practice was filed under curiosities or primitive habits, sometimes in the same paragraph as descriptions of superstitions or odd adornments. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the colonial gaze had a habit of turning what was practical, medicinal, or sacred into a spectacle for readers back home. Travel journals from West Africa spoke of Negro women gnawing lumps of earth without acknowledging that the lumps in question were kaolin, carefully selected and traded. Reports from the Amazon described tribes eating ashes from their own fires, but left out the detail that these ashes came from specific hardwoods, chosen for their mineral content. In the American South, enslaved people were punished for eating soil, with planters convinced it was a dangerous compulsion, though many of those same planters later sent their wives to doctors who prescribed imported clay for ladies' stomach complaints. The problem wasn't just misunderstanding, it was erasure. The medicinal logic, the ritual context, the survival strategies, all were replaced in the record with the language of pathology. Pica became the preferred term in medical circles, but its definition narrowed to imply deficiency or disorder, stripping away the cultural and environmental intelligence that shaped the habit. Even well-meaning observers brought their own blind spots. Missionaries who witnessed clay being eaten during rites of passage assumed it was symbolic of humility, missing entirely the detoxifying role it played in the plant-based purges that followed. Ethnographies sometimes noted the nutritional value of ash, only to dismiss it as an accidental benefit rather than an intentional choice. Yet, despite this long record of misinterpretation, the practice never disappeared. In fact, in many places it quietly adapted, moving from the fire pit and the riverbank to the market stall, and in some cases, to the health shop shelf, which is where it stands today, half hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice that the oldest remedies are still here, though dressed for the modern world. Today, the habit has traded its clay pits and cooking fires for shelves lined with neat packets and glossy labels. In parts of Ghana and Nigeria, kaolin still appears in open-air markets, stacked like pale bricks or rolled into marble-sized pellets, only now they're often wrapped in plastic, priced by weight, and advertised for wellness. Across the Atlantic, health food stores sell bentonite, detox, or activated charcoal in jars, capsules, and smoothie powders, promising everything from clearer skin to better digestion. The marketing is sleek, but the core is unchanged. People are still swallowing earth and the remains of fire. Urban adaptation hasn't erased the rural roots. In southern India, pregnant women in villages may still dig for the same clay their mothers preferred, while their city relatives buy it, pre-packaged from street vendors. In parts of the American South, older generations quietly keep a stash of chalky river clay, passing it to younger women as naturally as passing down recipes. Even the Ashant water mixtures once used after illness find echoes in herbal mineral tonics sold online. The persistence is telling. Modern science may debate the health claims, but anthropology sees something older at work, a continuity of taste, belief, and embodied knowledge that survives the churn of empires and economies. These substances endure not because they are fashionable, but because they fit into the human story. The instinct to put the land inside us, whether to heal, to protect, to survive, or simply because it feels right. And so the cycle turns. What once drew the curiosity of ancient physicians, the suspicion of colonial officers, and the quiet trust of those who practiced it, now sits in our kitchens and wellness routines. Another reminder that the strange is often just the familiar, untranslatable. The earth we walk on still finds its way into our mouths, carrying with it a little of the past each time.